She hadn't felt alive in years, until the young man next door changed everything. The first time I truly noticed her, she wasn't doing anything remarkable, just tending to the small garden outside her porch, her hands brushing over the tender green leaves with the kind of careful attention that makes ordinary tasks seem almost sacred. The morning sun caught her hair, highlighting streaks of silver that shimmered softly against the deeper brown, and I found myself staring longer than I intended, caught off guard by the quiet grace in her movements. She hummed a faint, unfamiliar tune, one that made me pause mid-step as I carried my groceries across the street. There was a subtle weight in her eyes, a delicate mix of sadness and resilience, that hinted at years I could never fully understand. Yet, in that same glance, there was a spark, a small flame of life that seemed to flicker and then retreat, like a secret she wasn't ready to share. I tried to tell myself it was curiosity, simple intrigue at the woman who had moved in next door months ago, but it was more than that. There was a magnetism, subtle and insistent, drawing my gaze whenever our paths almost crossed. The first time our eyes met directly, over the low white fence that separated our yards, I felt a sudden warmth in my chest, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat in a way that's both thrilling and unsettling. She gave a faint, polite smile, a smile that lingered just long enough to feel personal, yet brief enough to leave me wanting more. The scent of lavender wafted through the air from the small potted plant she tended, mingling with the earthy aroma of freshly watered soil. I inhaled it unconsciously, and for a moment, the ordinary sounds of the street, the distant hum of traffic, the chirping of birds, faded, leaving only that small, quiet moment suspended between us. There was no conversation, no exchanged words, yet the silence itself was intimate. It was the kind of connection that happens in brief, fleeting seconds, but leaves a lasting impression. Later that day, I found myself inventing reasons to glance out the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of her moving gracefully around her garden or pausing to sip coffee on her porch. It wasn't infatuation, at least not in the obvious sense. It was the pull of something deeper, an unspoken recognition, an instinctive curiosity about who she was beneath the calm, confident exterior. I noticed how she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with the gentlest touch, the faint crease of thought on her brow, the way her lips curved in a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes yet hinted at a hidden softness. Even in those first, silent observations, I felt a stirring of something unfamiliar, a desire to know her, not for appearances or surface charm, but to understand the quiet moments of her life that made her, her. The spark was there, delicate and cautious, but unmistakable, an invitation to a story that hadn't yet begun, waiting for both of us to notice it. And so, my quiet curiosity became an unspoken promise, to watch, to wait, and to learn, one small, stolen moment at a time. It was in the grocery store that our paths crossed again, though neither of us could call it intentional. I was reaching for a carton of milk when her hand brushed against mine. The contact was fleeting, almost accidental, but it jolted me in a way that lingered far longer than it should have. She looked up, eyes wide for just a moment, and then softened into a warm, self-aware smile. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, her voice calm but carrying a lightness I hadn't noticed before. "No, it's okay," I replied, my own voice steadier than I felt. There was something about the subtle tilt of her head, the small crease that formed near her eyes when she smiled, that made me pause, catching myself studying her like she was more fascinating than the shelves around us. We laughed softly over the near miss, a brief sound that felt like an unexpected bridge between two worlds. It was an ordinary setting, yet in that moment, time seemed to stretch. There was a rhythm to the way we moved around each other in the aisle, almost instinctive, like we were dancing without realizing it. She shared little details, how she preferred the store's fresh bakery section, a tiny joke about always getting lost among the towering shelves, and I found myself drawn not just to her words, but to the subtle way she spoke them. Every gesture felt considered, every glance intentional, though nothing was overtly flirtatious. Her presence was calming, yet it stirred something restless in me. I noticed the warmth of her fingers brushing against mine again as we reached for the same loaf of bread. This time, neither of us recoiled. Instead, we lingered in the touch, almost imperceptibly, like two people testing the edges of a connection they hadn't fully acknowledged. I could feel a pulse of electricity there, not loud or frantic, but steady and undeniable. As we continued shopping together, the conversation flowed with surprising ease. She spoke of simple pleasures, a favorite tea, a book she was enjoying, the quiet satisfaction of cooking for herself, and each story revealed fragments of her life. I listened, attentive, noting the gentle curve of her lips, the way her eyes softened when she laughed, the slight pause she took as if measuring the weight of her words before sharing them. It was in these small, delicate details that I began to understand her, how her confidence carried a shadow of loneliness, how her grace masked a tender vulnerability. By the time we reached the checkout, there was an unspoken understanding between us. A small smile lingered as our eyes met again over the counter, heavier this time with recognition and curiosity. Even as I stepped out into the sunlight, groceries in hand, the warmth of her presence seemed to follow me, wrapping around my chest like a quiet, persistent heartbeat. I realized then that these accidental encounters were no longer just coincidences. They were the beginning of a slow, deliberate unraveling, a subtle dance of proximity and observation. Every glance, every touch, even the smallest one, was a thread pulling us closer, weaving a connection neither of us could yet name, but both of us felt in the marrow of our bones. And in that quiet hum of shared space, I knew this was only the start of something far deeper than curiosity. It happened one late afternoon, almost without plan. I was carrying a heavy bag of groceries to my apartment when I noticed her struggling with a few bags just outside her door. Without thinking, I crossed the small stretch of lawn and offered to help. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, that familiar flicker of guardedness in her eyes, before nodding and handing over a bag. As we walked up the steps together, our shoulders brushed lightly. That brief contact sent a shiver through me, not of fear or desire in a raw sense, but of a quiet recognition, as if my body had known this connection before my mind had fully caught up. She laughed softly, a sound that was warm and unhurried, filling the small space between us with something intimate and human. Once inside, the aroma of her home enveloped me, hints of baked bread mingled with a subtle floral note, perhaps from her favorite candle. The living room was modest but welcoming, with soft lighting that softened the edges of the day. We set the groceries down, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, simply existing in shared silence. It was a comfortable kind of stillness, one that didn't need words but carried a quiet acknowledgement of trust. She sat on the edge of the couch, and I took a chair nearby. Our conversation started hesitantly, like stepping onto ice that might not hold. She began to talk about her life, the small, tender details of her days, the little routines she had built since her husband passed. There was a vulnerability there, subtle but present, and I felt honored that she would let me witness it. I shared fragments of my own life too, insecurities, dreams, and moments that rarely found their way into conversation. We laughed occasionally, the sound echoing softly off the walls, but there were also pauses that were equally telling, moments heavy with unspoken understanding. At one point, she reached for a cup of tea, her fingers brushing against mine as she handed it to me. The touch was gentle, fleeting, but it lingered in my memory long after. I noticed the warmth of her hand, the slight tremor when she let go, and the way her eyes met mine, not with expectation, but with quiet openness. It was in these small gestures, these shared intimacies of mundane life, that the slow pulse of connection began to form. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves of the trees, a soft background to our conversation. I found myself observing every detail, the tilt of her head when she listened, the subtle curve of her smile, the way her gaze softened whenever she spoke of moments of joy or sorrow. Each observation deepened my awareness of her, of the complexity beneath her calm exterior. By the time I left, carrying the last of her groceries back to my apartment, there was a sense of something unspoken between us, a quiet acknowledgement that our worlds, though different in years and experience, were beginning to intersect in ways neither of us could yet define. It wasn't attraction in a rush, nor was it friendship fully formed. It was something tender, fragile, and promising, the the start of a connection that neither time nor circumstance could easily undo. And as I walked back to my own apartment, I felt a strange warmth in my chest, the awareness that this slow, careful unfolding of trust and closeness was only just beginning. It was during one of those ordinary afternoons, the kind that drifts by almost unnoticed, that I first became acutely aware of the tension between us, not in words, but in the spaces between words, the silences that lingered longer than they should. After weeks of small interactions, quiet conversations, and shared moments, the awareness of her presence had begun to settle in my chest like a warm weight, both comforting and disorienting. I found myself thinking about her more often than I cared to admit. Not just the occasional glance over the fence or our grocery store encounters, but the little details, the subtle way her fingers curved around a teacup, the gentle inflection of her laughter, the way her eyes softened when she spoke of memories both happy and painful. Each memory of her lingered, persistent and insistent, reminding me that my curiosity had grown into something more complicated, a delicate, almost forbidden awareness of desire I didn't know how to name. She, too, seemed aware of the unspoken pull. The first time it truly struck me, we were walking down the street after a late afternoon at the library. The conversation had grown quiet, the kind of comfortable silence where words aren't needed, yet every glance, every shift of weight carried meaning. I noticed her hand brush lightly against mine as we passed a hedge, a touch so brief that it could have been accidental, but the way she didn't immediately withdraw it told me otherwise. There was a hesitation in her eyes, a flicker of vulnerability, as if she were aware of the tension and trying to reconcile it within herself. It was impossible to ignore. The age gap between us, the invisible line that society might scrutinize, hovered at the edges of every interaction. I could feel it in her pauses, in the careful way she measured what she said, in the fleeting looks she cast when she thought I wasn't noticing. And yet, in the same moments, there was warmth, a steady undercurrent of trust and curiosity that refused to be dismissed. Every smile, every subtle gesture seemed to carry the weight of something unspoken, and it both thrilled and unsettled me. I began to notice how her presence affected me physically. My chest would tighten slightly when she laughed, my pulse quickened when our eyes met unexpectedly, and even the softest brush of her hand left an echo, a quiet reminder of something tender and electric. It was a tension that demanded awareness, a slow-burning fire that I both wanted to indulge and feared to acknowledge. We spent more time together in those days, sometimes by design, sometimes by coincidence. A walk to the corner cafe, a shared bench in the park, moments that seemed ordinary but were laden with subtle significance. Every brush of skin, every shared laugh, every pause that stretched just a second too long, deepened the complexity of what was forming between us. It was no longer just curiosity, it was recognition, longing, and the gentle fear of stepping too close to something that could change everything. By evening, as I walked back to my apartment, I realized that this tension was no longer something to ignore. It was alive, pulsing between us, and neither of us could escape it. And in that quiet awareness, I understood, the story between us was no longer accidental, it was inevitable, and every choice we made would shape the delicate path ahead. It was one quiet evening when the walls between us seemed to soften completely. I had dropped by her apartment under the pretense of returning a book she had lent me, but the air between us felt charged in a way that made ordinary gestures feel heavy with meaning. She greeted me with that gentle smile, the one that always seemed to hover between warmth and a quiet sadness, and for a moment, I forgot why I had come. We settled on the couch, a soft blanket draped over the cushions, and I noticed the way she adjusted it around us with care, as if creating a private cocoon in which nothing else could intrude. There was a subtle closeness in how our legs nearly touched, in the way our shoulders aligned when we leaned back, careful but unforced. The room was dimly lit, the golden glow of a single lamp casting soft shadows across her face, highlighting the delicate curve of her cheek and the faint lines of years that told stories I would never fully know. She began to speak quietly about her late husband, her voice low and steady, carrying memories both tender and painful. I listened, captivated not just by her words, but by the rhythm of her breathing, the slight tremor when she reached a particularly poignant memory. I wanted to reach out, to offer some gesture of comfort, but I hesitated, aware of the fragile boundary between care and intrusion. And yet, the distance seemed to shrink naturally. Her hand, so light it barely grazed mine, found its way to rest momentarily on my arm. The touch was almost imperceptible, but it left a warmth that radiated deeper than skin deep. In turn, I found myself opening up, sharing fragments of my own life I rarely voiced, fears, insecurities, and the dreams that often felt too naive to speak aloud. She listened without judgment, her gaze unwavering, as if each word I offered was a treasure she had been waiting for. There was no rush, no pressure, only the steady ebb and flow of two people learning to navigate a closeness that was both exciting and intimidating. At one point, she leaned slightly closer, her head brushing the edge of my shoulder. The faint scent of her perfume mixed with the subtle aroma of the blanket and the soft hum of the city outside, creating a bubble in which the world beyond the room seemed to disappear. The warmth of her presence, the subtle pressure of her head against me, felt grounding and exhilarating all at once. It was a connection that went beyond words, beyond conscious thought, a communion of trust, of shared vulnerability, of unspoken understanding. Even in moments of laughter over trivial things, a forgotten line from the movie we were watching, a playful tease about my clumsy attempts at carrying groceries, the tenderness lingered. Each glance, each brush of skin, each soft sigh carried weight, a reminder of how slowly, deliberately, affection was building between us. When I left that night, the memory of her proximity stayed with me, a quiet warmth in my chest. It was no longer merely curiosity or attraction, it was recognition. The awareness that something profound, delicate, and entirely human was unfolding, and that our bond was moving toward a depth neither of us could ignore. The tension between us had been building quietly for weeks, threaded through casual touches, lingering glances, and conversations that revealed more than either of us intended. But that evening, it reached a point where it could no longer remain unspoken. It wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic confrontation, it was life itself nudging us together in a way that demanded presence, care, and honesty. She had called me earlier, her voice unusually strained, hinting at an unexpected difficulty with her sister. I arrived at her apartment to find her pacing lightly, phone clutched tightly in her hand, a faint crease between her brows. The moment she saw me, relief softened her features, and she exhaled as though she had been holding her breath for days. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, and in that one line, I sensed both gratitude and vulnerability. We spent hours talking through the situation, my presence meant to reassure her, to help her navigate a moment of crisis. And yet, amidst the practical discussion, there was an undercurrent of something more, something neither of us could fully name but both deeply felt. Every time our hands brushed as she gestured or reached for her papers, a shiver of awareness traveled along my arm. Her shoulder occasionally pressed against mine, small but deliberate, and I felt the heat of proximity, the subtle intimacy of shared space. At one point, she sank onto the couch, exhausted, and I followed, careful not to crowd her. She leaned slightly against me, resting her head lightly on my shoulder. The touch was unassuming, almost accidental in appearance, but it carried a resonance that neither words nor deliberate action could replicate. I could feel the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, the quiet shift of her weight, and the soft rise and fall of her breath. It was in that silence, in that gentle contact, that the depth of our bond became undeniable. We spoke little after that, the crisis slowly resolving itself, but the energy between us was undeniable. She glanced up at me, eyes glistening with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something quieter, more intimate. My hand hovered near hers, almost brushing, and for a long moment, we simply held that space, acknowledging the connection that had grown from curiosity, shared moments, and subtle vulnerability into something far more significant. The emotional peak was quiet, tender, and profound, not marked by a confession shouted aloud, but by mutual recognition of what had been blossoming between us. I reached out, gently taking her hand in mine, and she didn't pull away. Our fingers entwined naturally, a simple act loaded with meaning, comfort, desire, trust, and an unspoken willingness to explore this fragile, beautiful connection. By the time I left her apartment that night, the air between us had shifted irreversibly. The pull that had been simmering quietly had found its acknowledgement. There was warmth, hope, and a subtle promise lingering in every lingering glance, every soft squeeze of our hands. It wasn't a rush toward romance, but the delicate, irresistible moment when hearts recognized one another and the world outside ceased to matter. For both of us, the story had reached its emotional apex, the point where hesitation met longing, and the possibility of love, patient and slow-burning, became impossible to ignore. The days that followed felt different, though nothing about the world had changed. The street outside her apartment was the same, the sun rose and set in the same way, and the gentle hum of life continued its quiet rhythm, but between us, something had shifted irrevocably. The tension that had lingered for weeks had softened into a steady warmth, a comfort that neither of us had expected but both quietly cherished. It started with small gestures, each one deliberate in its tenderness. Morning coffee shared on her porch, sunlight spilling across the cushions and warming our skin as we sipped quietly. Our hands brushed more often, but now the touches carried intention, slight squeezes, fingers lingering longer, palms pressing briefly together in silent acknowledgement of connection. The air between us seemed charged with unspoken understanding, yet relaxed in its intimacy. There was no urgency, no need to rush, our bond had the patience of long familiarity, even in its newness. We laughed more easily now, comfortable in the rhythm of each other's presence. Simple acts, a shared joke, a playful nudge, the way she rested her head lightly on my shoulder while reading, felt like conversations of their own, full of trust and delight. Even the small silences were rich with meaning, the quiet of our footsteps walking down the street, the gentle hum of a fan as we sat together, the soft sound of her laughter echoing in the room. Each moment reinforced the bond that had grown from curiosity into companionship, from vulnerability into mutual affection. I noticed the way she moved through her space now, more relaxed, more alive, as if the invisible weight she had carried for years had begun to lift. There was a sparkle in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a subtle lightness in her step, the gentle curve of her smile that hinted at joy quietly reclaimed. And I felt it too, the steady pulse of belonging, of connection, of a love that didn't demand, didn't hurry, but simply existed in the shared rhythm of two people who had learned to trust one another. One afternoon, as we watched the sun dip below the horizon from her porch, our hands intertwined naturally, she spoke softly, "I haven't felt alive in years, until now." Her words hung in the air, carrying both vulnerability and certainty, a simple truth that mirrored the awareness that had grown quietly in my own heart. I squeezed her hand, leaning slightly closer, and she rested her head on my shoulder. It was a small gesture, yet it felt monumental, a seal on the delicate, slow-growing intimacy that had blossomed between us. By the time evening fell, there was a comforting rhythm to our closeness. The world outside continued as usual, but within the walls of her apartment, or on that sunlit porch, we had found a space that was ours alone. There was trust, warmth, laughter, and a gentle understanding of each other's hearts. We weren't rushing, weren't defining everything in grand terms, we were simply existing together, fully present, fully aware, fully alive. The story closed on quiet contentment, our bond unspoken yet undeniable, our affection gentle yet profound. The age gap, the social norms, the hesitation and fear, all had faded into the background, leaving only two people who had discovered something rare, a love patient, tender, and deeply human. And in that shared stillness, we both knew we had found home, not in a place, but in each other. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more slow-burn romance tales. Comment below, would you take a chance on a love that surprises you when you least expect it?